Before we come to more of our panelists' thoughts, let's bring in the audience now. May I request all those who have questions to raise their hands? A mic will come to you. Just briefly introduce yourself and no more than 30 seconds for a question, please.
Hi, sir. My name is Vijay, and I'm an international affairs student. So, my question is 4 years' time a fair enough amount of time to judge Mr. Modi's global ambition? If yes, and if you think it's failed, who is the alternate that this country is looking for in this way?
We'll take 2 or 3 questions. Who's got the mic this side? 30 seconds.
Yeah, Dr. Surjit Dudeja. Mr. Sinha, you claim you are the scriptwriter of the first not to use nuclear. So this is a reflection of weakness or strength. When we say offense is the best strength, or offense is the best defense, and Mr. Modi, who is practicing a surgical strike, so don't you think that he can be sticking to this no first use?
Thank you. Who's got the mic?
Yeah, hello. This is Nilanjan. I wanted to ask, I've never understood how nuclear weapons are going to help us. Because whether we use it first or China uses it first, both of us are going to end up nuking each other. So no one's going to benefit. And since 99...
That's true of conventional weapons also.
Right. But this is, far more destructive. And ever since 99, our security environment hasn't improved at all, because after that you first had the Kargil War, and then you've had a number of other
Who's your question addressed to?
To all of you. The question is, how are nuclear weapons going to help, whether you have first use or you have second use?
Mr. Menon, will you take that one on?
I give him one answer, he can get another one.
Okay, answers to those 3 questions. Bharat, you first.
You have set up a straw man. Would our security be any better if it didn't have nuclear weapons? That's almost, for me, a nonsensical question. In the main, because I think most major powers, unless you don't want India to ever be a major power, that's fine. That may be a viewpoint that many, in effect, support, and that we should have economic priorities, etc. But the point I think to make is, unless you have the kind of you maintain a standard that is the international standard. That's why I've been advocating thermonuclear weapons that are tested, proven, etc., and not the kind that fizzled in 1998, the S1 test. It is not really a test that really inspires any confidence. The point about the nuclear demolition munitions in the Himalayan passes, or first use of Prahar, missiles with nuclear warheads and so on that I recommended, is precisely that you cannot, is the Pakistan angle. Pakistan has dealt with Indian conventional superiority by threatening to nuke. Now the question is, you and I, certainly I don't think it is at all credible, because in terms of exchange ratio that I always stress, Pakistan will stand to be decimated. But the point is, the underlying logic still works, deterrence logic, that, well, you'll have to, it's a bluff. Do you want to call it? This is the politicians' thing, you see, that where the utility is. No, I think that's the politicians.
Sir, you would like to...
On the nuclear weapons, I think the fact is that when we went overtly nuclear in 98, we said that we had done so to prevent nuclear threats, blackmail, and to establish deterrence, because we had other countries around us which already had nuclear weapons. Before 98, Pakistan had threatened us with the use of nuclear weapons to try and change our behavior. The US had run a nuclear-powered carrier into the Indian Ocean in 71. All these were attempts to use a nuclear threat to change your behavior. After that, there hasn't been a threat like that. Now, it is a different question that people like Bharat believe that you can also use nuclear weapons to affect the conventional part of the spectrum and the rest of it. There are the official position of the government of India is that no, That's not what we have our weapons for. Conventional we'll deal with as conventional, etc., etc. So that's a different argument. But just by the status purpose of why we had nuclear weapons, why we became overtly nuclear, they've served their purpose. And they've kept the peace. Now, can you fight a conventional war in nuclearized conditions? Yes, Kargil proved that you can. There might be limits on what you think you can do, but certainly you did. You already had gone nuclear, both of you, overtly, and you then fought a conventional war. And you won it on the ground. So, frankly, I think a lot of this is miasma, and because we confuse ourselves with what the use of nuclear weapons is. It is true, the ultimate use of all our nuclear weapons and so on a huge scale would be disastrous, and disastrous for both countries. Probably more disastrous for Pakistan. It lacks depth, and the effects would be much worse. But for 9 months of the year, the prevailing winds in the subcontinent are westerly. So don't think that it won't affect you either. So there is a calculus here, but the point is deterrence. You want to prevent that war from taking place, and if you didn't have the weapons, the chance of other people using their weapons against you or threatening to use it is much higher. That's why we have the weapons, and we declare no first use.
Well, the point I wanted to make was going back to what I said in response to the first question that you asked me about no first use. That if it is a deterrent, then no first use detracts from that deterrence. And therefore, as I said earlier, I personally believe that we should, or we could revise, so that it stays as a deterrent, and also recall to mind the famous letter that Mr. Vajpayee wrote to President Clinton immediately after the tests were conducted in 1998, in which he clearly said that it was meant for China and not for Pakistan. So China is recognized as a threat. It continues to be a threat. And in the context of China, and I agree with Bharat, not so much in the context of Pakistan, a no first use theory, I repeat, detracts from deterrence.
I think nobody argues, Ajay, nobody argues, I think, that we shouldn't review. In fact, we have reviewed at least 3 times that I know of since the original no first use declaration. Each time we have come back to the conclusion that for the present, this serves our purpose best. But that, this is something that we have to keep looking at and we have to keep going back to, because the situation never stays the same. And what our potential is doing is to develop their own weapons and change what they have all the time.
Well, Mr. Sinha and I have traveled in different boats for the last 20 years. But in the last 2 years, we are in the same boat. And we are discovering many things in common. But I have to say that I vehemently, and categorically disagree with him that India should revise its no first use doctrine. It will be a disaster if we were to revise our no first use doctrine. There are many reasons why we must continue to uphold the no first use doctrine. And I think I have to disagree with you, sir. But that's the only point of disagreement. I'm sure there are other.
The only point I'd like to make is we use the term credible minimum deterrent.
Yes.
And some people say minimum credible deterrent.
It is.
Okay,
you're absolutely right. It's credible minimum deterrent. Absolutely.
Okay, let's move on from nuclear weapons to the question of is 4 years enough, which also came. And since you're from outside Lutyens, Delhi, and in touch with the common man, sir, may I ask you to answer that question?
Is 4 years enough?
To judge Modi and what? And remove him from power if necessary. Who is the alternative?
I think these two gentlemen are better placed to answer the last question. But I think 4 years are more than enough to gauge the drift of what's going to happen. And especially as we've just discussed, to judge by all the promises that were made. And I speak once again from the security angle. I read the manifesto, the election manifesto of the party just after the elections. National security, of course, came 73rd out of 76 items which were listed there. which included all sorts of things: sports, youth welfare, water, etc., etc. And there were there were what, 12 or 13 items. The top 5 were national security reform, one rank, one pension, national war memorial, national maritime authority. These were the first 5 out of the agenda. Only 2 or 3 have been. The most important was national security reform, which has been promised by many governments and so on. It never happened. So I think the signs, I mean, if the intentions were there, something could have started, and 4 years is more than enough to make your intentions clear. So I think there's another few months to go. By then, the verdict should be quite clear whether the performance has lived up to the promise or not. And then it's up to and once again I go back, I don't think it's audiences or forums like this who will decide. It's a man on the street, and I don't think many of us can gauge what he feels about what all is happening, both on the economic front, on the social front, and so on. So I leave it
just
there.
on the lighter note, 4 years is not enough. 5 years is enough. That's why the makers of the Constitution have scheduled general elections for every 5 years and given the people a voice. Sir.
Lalit Mansingh. I confess I belong to the 98% compromised people in the Foreign Service. And I still regard Bharat Karnat as a friend. Now, I think the essential issue here is Bharat wants a different India. And I admire the consistency with which he has advocated. Now, I consider him an intellectual jihadi. Intellectual, fortunately. But let's go along with his premises. Let's scrap the no first use. Let's go in for thermonuclear weapons. Let's be the top military power in the world. Let's be a serious military power, as he wants us to say. And the question I want to put, not to Bharat because I know his views, I want to put it across to Mr. Yashwant Sinha as a former finance minister, to Ramesh as an economist. What would be the bill? What would the bill look like if you were to adopt it? Let's say, would you be willing to raise defense spending to 6% to 10% GDP and scrap all the other things? Would you like to have a total reform of the government, sack the 98% of the Foreign Service officers who are tainted, and same thing I suppose would apply to the armed forces and others? What kind of India are we looking at, and what's the price tag that India will have to pay for that?
No,
May
more
I?
questions. Who's got the mic?
Yeah, I do.
Colonel Bhatt.
Bharat, I can't help but ask with your title, Staggering Forward, if Modi is staggering forward, what about his predecessors barring Indira Gandhi and Atal Vajpayee? Thank you.
Who's got the mic? Nobody's got the mic? Okay.
Yeah, my name is G.V. Bagai. First, I'd like to know what you think of the nuclear deal. I mean, we were desperate for it, but we've had excellent successes in space and missiles. If we did not have the nuclear deal, would we have also then taken effort to indigenize our own efforts? I mean, and secondly, you said Pakistan is just a distraction, but it's really tearing our secular fabric completely. And thanks to Trump, now the Chinese themselves are bending towards us economically and even militarily. They will move away.
Right.
So
Right.
should we not therefore lose our focus on Pakistan, and also remember that the Chinese have not fired a single shot in 50 years? Thank you.
Okay, that's 3 questions. Ambassador Mansingh's question, sir, would you take it on?
Well, I think my very brief comment on that question will be that fortunately Bharat has not prescribed a time span, So, in how much time would we spend the kind of money?
Yesterday, yes.
I think you meant yesterday.
Yesterday is gone and forgotten. But, I mean, the point I'll make is it will be difficult given our financial situation. It will not be possible that tomorrow we decide and we start spending billions of dollars on defense, more than what we are spending now. But over a period of time, some of it could be achieved if the direction is very clear, and that's where foreign direct investment in defense production will also play an important role. But I'll be very cautious with regard to his suggestion that we should go for fresh nuclear tests, because this time it will not be a repeat of 98. It will be much worse.
Well, this is a question that, I've tried to grapple with for the last 25 years. What's the sustainable level of defense expenditure for this economy? And given the multiple claims on scarce resources, it seems to me that if we were to decide that 10 years from now, India should be spending somewhere between 4 to 5% of her GDP on defense, it's a doable proposition. 4 to 5% of GDP may look low, and that's why I don't like this percentage of GDP metric. I would rather look at it as what proportion of the government expenditure goes into defense. Now, if you look at all the other sectors that are making claims on these resources, some years ago I did work out that anywhere between 15 to 20% of government expenditure, annual government expenditure going to defense, is something that the country can absorb. But I agree with Mr. Sinha that this is something that will not happen overnight. In fact, because GDP has grown so impressively over the last 15 years, as a proportion of GDP, defense expenditure is really actually falling, and it's actually come down to levels which are quite unconscionable given the security environment in which we operate. So the answer to your question is, I would set myself a target. I would say that we should achieve this in the next 5 years, maybe reach 3.5% of GDP in 5 years' time, maybe reach 4.5%, 5% of GDP, but anything over 5%, I don't think that this country is going to be able to absorb it. The economy is not going to be able to absorb it, because I don't see the economy growing at 10% per year. I mean, I think a sustainable growth is going to be anywhere between 7.5% to 8%. If we are lucky, we'll get 8%. But if we do the things that we've been doing and do it a little better, we probably sustain ourselves at 7.5% per year. So that's the answer to your question.
And may I add that we'll also have to take into account our capacity to spend. Look at the defense budget year after year and the amount that we surrender each year.
If I, as a humble defense hack, may also weigh in on this, it's not about just raising the levels of expenditure. Jairam talks about 4 to 5%. That's a staggering amount. Today we're at 2.16% of GDP. No, I count pensions in my calculation. Defense pensions is absolutely to be counted. So it's 2.16%, which is something that we can barely sustain as it is, 16% of government expenditure. But it's not about increasing the expenditure, but how that expenditure is actually utilized, the balance between capital and revenue, the indigenization programs that can take some of the load off foreign procurements and so on. We can optimize the expenditure a lot better. Bharat?
This is one of my pet peeves from my days as advisor defense expenditure to the 10th Finance Commission. And my secret report, the classified report, I don't know, Shankar, whether you saw it when you were in government, but it made the point then, that is almost 25 years ago, that we buy the wrong armaments for the wrong reasons, for the wrong front. And then we get into trouble. And then we say we don't have the requisite capabilities. The fact of the matter is, resources are not the problem, Lalit. It's sheer misuse of resources. We buy the wrong things. And then we buy them. These are the most capital-intensive armaments that you can find, which, of course, the services hanker for, which we buy, in part because there's no expert advice anywhere to the government. The government says, well, the military is the professional advisors, and therefore we don't need outside advisors. So you get into this vicious cycle of the user also advising you on what to buy, and given the institutional biases and inducements, whatever, and vested interest, let's be very clear about it. The armaments importing now has an enormous vested system of vested interest. So these are the problems. Now, the one last thing. The fact of the matter is the government can tomorrow decree that there'll be no imports. What will that do? I mean, just a straight out no imports. What will it do? First of all, it'll compel, as we were compelled in strategic armaments, where we have attained sufficiency. And by the way, our Agni 5 is the top-rated missile, can compare with anything anywhere in the world. Is that accurate? If many of people here know the CEP, the circular error probable, the accuracy, you'll be astonished. It's very good. These are the kinds of things we have achieved on our own. Now, if tomorrow the government were to decree that, there'll be some disruption, of course, because the military is used to doing things. But that's where a strong nuclear force would help, because that's where the utility of nuclear weapons, in case someone wants to take advantage of our enfeebled conventional military posture for a while, will come sort of kick in.
Just wiping the mic from him.
Just a brief point. Bharat, for the last 70 years, we were at one point buying entirely from the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union gave us not what we wanted or what we asked for, but what their marshals and admirals thought was good for us. Things like the Petyab corvettes, the Nanuchkas, the AN-14, completely useless things, MiG-23. So they gave us what they felt was good for us. And there were no green cards in Russia, nor were any children sent for education to Russia. And we faithfully complied with the government's instructions for 70 years. And your second point about stopping, it won't be a minor interruption. It will take at least 15 to 20 years for the Indian military-industrial complex to stabilize and produce in large quantities, large enough to do for your defense. So it's not going to be a minor. So this is a bit drastic to say no imports and use desi.
Can you take on the question about the diplomacy? The last question that came. What was that question again?
About the nuclear deal. Well, I'm not sure what you think.
Yeah, we've got it. We've got it.
No, but we indigenized long before the nuclear deal. And frankly, what have we imported? We've imported Russian reactors. We've said quite clearly that we'll only import if it's as safe, if it's competitive, and if it meets our standards. And that's what we're negotiating with France and the US and with others. So I'm not sure how the nuclear deal affects our indigenous program, which it hasn't, or how it has, and it hasn't certainly affected our strategic program. I mean, there's no link because we've separated the two ourselves a long time ago. What it did enable us to do is to buy uranium on the international market because we don't produce enough. And if you look at plant load factors in our nuclear power plants, it's gone up from at one stage down to about 40%, all the way up to about in the high 80s and the low 90s. So that's quite a big change. So I don't understand quite where that connection is between them in your mind.
Right, last round of 3 questions, after which we've got to wrap up.
Remains unanswered. Bharat, Modi staggered forward.
Modi said.
Then who of his predecessors, what have they done? Barring Indira Gandhi and...
That's a comment, not a question.
No, it's a question. Who, if Modi staggering forward?
He's okay. We'll deal with that.
I want to ask a question to Mr.
Who's got the mic? Who's got the mic? Ask the question.
I have the mic.
Can we have the...
I have it.
Yeah, Jyoti, come.
Okay. My question to all you gentlemen is, with this whole process of acquisition of defense or manufacture of equipment, what about the Rafale? Do we need it?
Everybody's recommending developing your own aircraft.
Do we need the Rafale? Does that mean that all
Who's
you
the question addressed?
Or to all
put-
of you, to
we'll
1,
put
2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of you.
Admiral
Do
Arun
we need
Prakash,
the
since
Rafale?
Admiral Arun Prakash is a naval officer, but he's been a pilot and a decorated pilot in the Indian Air Force, so he'll answer that question.
So he will put his neck on the block. Yes, we do need a Rafale or something like that for the Indian Air Force, which is rapidly denuding in its strength. We do need an aircraft, and 36 was not really enough. They wanted 126. The whole issue, I think, is a storm in a teacup, because if the government were to put its cards on the table and give out generic values of various components of this deal, it would not compromise national security, and it will get them out of the soup that they seem to have got themselves in.
Colonel Sen.
Yeah. Right. My question is addressed to Mr. Shiv Shankar Menon. The question itself is very brief. It's based on your use of the term strategic weapon and the subsequent entire range of discussion that's taken place. My question is, how do we see our nuclear missile program as strategic when we don't have a corresponding civil program for providing the underground bunkers and things that all major powers have? Because without it, it's incredible, and which is why the Chinese don't even look at us as a nuclear weapon power.
You mean why don't we have civil defense against nuclear? Well, I think the reason it's called, at least why they're called strategic weapons, is because of the effect that they have, the range and the effect. I mean, to distinguish them from tactical and from conventional, that's all. In no country is civil defense, even those countries which made a huge investment, say in the 50s in the US, when school children were told to hide under their desks and so on. Nowhere is civil defense part of the strategic military program. That's a separate problem. That's really a problem for the politicians to decide about how they want to handle, for instance, even for a conventional war. There was a time when all of us in school used to be told what to do, how to handle blackouts, etc. I'm not sure that that happens anymore. At least my son's generation didn't get any of that kind of training on civil defense. And we seem to have moved away from it. But even those countries which did huge investment in tunnels, in civil defense, China, US, and so on, they've moved away from it now. And none of them today practice those kinds of drills at least for nuclear attack anymore, or to try and frighten their populations. Maybe they just feel that with the lethality of weapons today, this is not worth it, or they don't want the political cost of frightening their population and saying you're so insecure that you need to keep practicing these things. I don't know. I can't answer that.
Last question from that lady.
I'm Neena J. Gupta. This is to Mr. Karnad. I wonder if you're aware that at the UN level, they have formed a Parliamentarians for Nuclear Disarmament, and 3/4 of the member states of the UN have signed that we want to be nuclear free. And it will be left, at the end of it, the only powerful nuclear countries, Russia, China, India also, to have been left with the nuclear power, to be a nuclear power. Now, what do you think? Is this a fizzle? Is this movement going to be a fizzled one? Or is it going to be accommodating by the power countries towards the other countries which have said we want to be nuclear free?
Asking Bharat this question is like asking a tiger about vegetarianism.
No, basically, I don't think that movement is going anywhere. It's stillborn, and no one gives a damn for it, to be very honest.
Okay, do we have time for more questions? Okay, sure.
Hello, my name is Shaktivel, sir, and my question is for Shiv Shankar Menon. So, what is do you see the possibility of Quad turning into an infrastructure alliance?
The Quad turning into an infrastructure alliance.
To counter BRI.
I think, frankly, Quad has to make up its mind what it does. right now it doesn't have a clear plan of what it's about. They've only met twice, once 2007-8, then stillborn for a long time, now it's been resurrected. And different people speak in different terms. We don't even have a common definition of the Indo-Pacific. I mean, when Prime Minister Modi spoke in Shangri-La and in Singapore, he defines from Africa to the American coast, whereas the Americans define it as from the India to, because they define it with PACOM rather than, so we don't even know what we're talking about here, about the Quad. So I think to see it as an answer to BRI or a huge infrastructure alliance, no, there are other ideas. The Japanese idea, for instance, and the Japanese are willing to actually fund and work with several other powers. What Bharat says, I think, has a point, that you need to involve ASEAN if this is to have any real meaning, either in maritime security or building connectivity or infrastructure, whatever you choose to do. If you want this Quad to have any real meaning, it must involve ASEAN. Whether you can throw the Americans out as Bharat wants, that's another whole issue.
I just want to make one comment. In addition to the fact that there's no index in this book, which Shiv Shankar Menon has very rightly pointed out. You know, there's an old story that Mr. Natwar Singh once told me, that the only thing worthwhile to read in a book is the index first. You look for your name whether you're quoted or not. But it's quite apart from this, I just want to make one point on this book. This is focused exclusively on Mr. Modi. And one of the problems in this book is that Bharat psychoanalyzes Mr. Modi to death, forgetting the social context, the social forces, the processes that have led to his emergence and that have led to his consolidation in the last 4 years. I think I find that more useful than this typology of 6, pigeonholing leaders into these categories. And I think leaders have their own style. They leave their own imprint, but they also reflect long-term trends in society. They also reflect certain social processes. They reflect our own fears, our own aspirations, our own expectations. I think that's something that this book could do with.
Okay, last question from Shujan Datta. Just yell it out.
My question is directed at Mr. Sinha.
Yes, sir.
Anyone on the desk can pitch in. Mr. Sinha, would you feel like an urban Naxal in trying to rationalize the humble Modi you knew to the man who took the unilateral and executive decision to buy not 126 but 36 Rafale?
I would not relate it exactly to that particular deal, but I would generally say that, the way we are made up or the way we are made, I think we worship people in power. So the day somebody occupies a position of power, that worship starts. And that's a national weakness, call it what you like. We stop analyzing, we stop trying to find out, we stop, we are very reluctant to be critical, and that is the reason why we don't question our leaders as we should. And, during the course of the questions from the audience, one of the questions which was asked and which we did not attempt to answer is, then who? I mean, this is a question that we've been asking from Nehru's time, for God's sake. After Nehru, who? After Indira Gandhi, who? After me, who? After who? What is this? I mean, this national preoccupation of after him, who, should be given up. The earliest we do it, the better it will be. And the earliest we give up worshipping people in power, the better it will be for India as a nation.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, on that elevating note, no, we've got to wrap up. It remains for me to thank. It remains for me to thank the speakers on the dais. It's been an extremely stimulating conversation. I've enjoyed it. I trust everybody else has enjoyed it. I'll close with just one recommendation. The unsaid thing about Bharat's book is that it's a very nicely written and articulated book. Bharat is one of the few Indian writers of non-fiction who writes very well. So I would recommend this book, if for no other reason, just for the writing alone. Copy is available outside. Bharat, you're going to sign them?
If anybody wishes.
I urge you to reach for your wallets. Thank you very much.